In the dusty town of Red Mesa, nestled deep in the foothills of New Mexico, lies the quiet ranch of Maria Lawson, the unassuming wife of a rancher. Outlaws, believing her husband to be an easy target, set their sights on the ranch, planning to rob and destroy everything the Lawsons have worked for. However, they make a fatal mistake. Maria, a former Marine sniper, has been living a quiet life, leaving behind the violent world she once knew. What happens next will tear apart the criminal empire targeting them, and make Red Mesa a town that will never forget the storm that passed through. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because tomorrow we have a special story for you. Maria Lawson's world was peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that people living in the heart of the West cherished, the kind of peace that came with the rustling of sagebrush, the distant howl of a coyote, and the soft whinny of the horses in the corral. Her husband, Jack, was a simple rancher, a man who loved the land, loved the cattle, and loved the quiet life they had built together. Maria had grown up in the shadow of violence, a time before Jack and the ranch had become her sanctuary. She had left behind the world of combat when she married him, determined to find a life of peace. The rifle she kept hidden in the barn, her pristine Marine sniper rifle, had been relics of a past that seemed a lifetime ago. But she could never forget how those weapons had kept her alive in far-off lands, how they had earned her the title the Desert Ghost among those who had seen her skill with a scope. Her hands, now rough from years of ranch work, had once been deadly in the hands of a sniper. The thought of that world, of the bloodshed and fear she had left behind, never sat well with her, but she had buried it. She had a new life now. As the sun dipped low in the western sky, casting long shadows over the ranch, Maria stood on the porch, her gaze drifting to the horizon. The land stretched out before her, vast and unyielding. She loved it, loved the simplicity it offered, and yet, today, something felt different. Something gnawed at her. "Jack," she called softly, her voice carrying on the breeze. Jack Lawson appeared from the barn, wiping his brow with a bandana. He was tall, with strong arms built from years of hard work, and his face was worn from the sun. He smiled at her as he approached, his boots crunching in the gravel driveway. "What's on your mind, Maria? You're looking like you've seen a ghost." She smiled faintly, but couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in her chest. "I don't know. Just something feels off. I've been watching the hills all day. Feels like someone's out there." Jack's expression softened. "There's no one out there, Maria. You know how it is. A bit of wild country, that's all." But Maria wasn't convinced. Her instincts, honed over years of combat, had never steered her wrong before. It wasn't just the usual quiet of the land. There was something in the air today, a strange stillness, a weight she couldn't quite place. It wasn't like the winds that blew across the plains. This felt deliberate. Before she could voice her concerns, the sharp sound of hooves reached her ears. She turned quickly, narrowing her eyes as the dust from the distant road kicked up, rising in a small cloud. "Jack," she murmured, her voice low, "we need to get inside. Now." Jack turned in the direction of her gaze, his face furrowing in concern. "What is it?" "Just do it, Jack. Please." Without question, Jack moved quickly toward the house. Maria followed close behind, her senses now fully alert. They made it to the porch, and she turned to look once more toward the approaching riders. The horses weren't moving at a steady pace. There was something about their gait, jittery, erratic. Whoever was riding those horses wasn't coming for a friendly visit. Jack stepped inside the house, but Maria lingered on the porch, her gaze fixed on the figures in the distance. There were 4 of them, riding hard, their faces obscured by wide-brimmed hats and dust. But the way they moved, the urgency in their pace, it wasn't normal. Outlaws. Her hand instinctively reached for the rifle slung across her shoulder. It wasn't the first time trouble had come to their doorstep, but Maria had always believed the past was behind her. That was the life she had tried so hard to forget, the life she had left behind in the desert and the jungles of war. But the moment those riders came into view, she knew it was time to face the demons of her past once again. She stepped inside the house, locking the door behind her. Jack was already at the window, peering out, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. "What are they doing?" he asked, his voice low. "They're not here for good reason," Maria said, her voice steady, but there was a quiet urgency behind it. "Get the cattle inside, Jack. Now, we've got trouble." Jack hesitated, but then nodded. He turned quickly, heading for the back door, his steps heavy with the realization that things were about to change. Maria moved toward the cupboard, pulling out a small box. Inside, she found her Marine-issued gear, the same gear she had kept hidden for years. She hadn't planned to ever use it again, but now there was no choice. Her fingers moved with precision as she assembled the rifle. Her eyes never left the window, the distant riders still approaching. She didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but Maria wasn't about to let anyone harm what she and Jack had worked so hard to build. Jack returned to the main room, his face grim. "They're getting closer." Maria nodded. "Get down. I'll cover you." She moved to the back window, the familiar weight of the rifle in her hands grounding her. Her mind sharpened, slipping back into a state of calm, focus that she had not felt in years. These men had made a deadly mistake. They had no idea who they were targeting. The riders were now less than a quarter-mile away. Maria's finger rested on the trigger, her heart steady, every inch of her body prepared for the fight that was coming. She was no longer just a rancher's wife. She was a soldier once more, and no one was going to take her husband's land. Maria's grip tightened on the rifle, her fingers wrapping around the cold steel of the barrel with a familiarity that sent a chill through her. The last time she had held this weapon, she had been on a very different battlefield, one where lives were lost, and no one knew the true cost of victory. But now, standing on her own porch with the sun sinking low behind her, Maria was ready to defend everything she had rebuilt. Jack, the land, the peace she had fought so hard for. Her breath slowed as she peered through the scope, adjusting the crosshairs on the closest rider. He was in the lead, his gait erratic as the horse he rode kicked up more dust with each desperate step. There was something about him that screamed danger, perhaps the way he gripped his rifle or the urgency in his movements. Whatever it was, Maria didn't need to waste time wondering. She knew what she had to do. Her heart beat in her ears, but her mind was calm, cold even. The years of training she had once used to protect the lives of those who couldn't protect themselves flooded back, steadying her hands. The last few years on the ranch had made her forget how sharp her skills could be, how deadly she was with a rifle. But not anymore. These men had no idea what they had just walked into. The rider was nearing the edge of the ranch property now, moving along the dusty road toward the house. He was the closest and the easiest target. Maria adjusted her position ever so slightly, moving an inch to the right to compensate for the wind. Her finger brushed the trigger, just enough to feel the cool pressure. She exhaled slowly, releasing the breath she had been holding, and then the rifle kicked back against her shoulder, a thunderous crack breaking the quiet evening air. The shot was precise, her aim true. The outlaw's body jerked violently as the bullet hit him square in the chest. His horse reared, throwing him off before it bolted into the wilderness. The man's body hit the ground with a dull thud, lifeless before he even hit the dirt. The wind carried the faint echo of the shot across the plains, and for a moment, all was still. Maria's pulse raced, but her movements remained controlled. She didn't need to look twice. She had done her job. The first threat had been neutralized, but it wasn't over. She quickly reloaded, never taking her eyes off the remaining riders. Her focus sharpened even further, and she realized just how badly these men had miscalculated. They had no idea who they were dealing with. "Maria," Jack's voice cut through the quiet, shaky with worry. What the hell just happened? She didn't turn to look at him. Her attention remained on the two remaining riders, who had now reined in their horses, coming to a sudden stop at the sight of their fallen comrade. They were yelling, cursing, and frantically searching for the source of the shot. They didn't see her, and they didn't know where the danger was coming from. Maria's eyes narrowed as she adjusted her aim again, now focusing on the second rider, who seemed to be the more tactical of the two. He was giving orders, gesturing to his partner to spread out. It was the kind of move a trained outlaw would make, smart, calculating, but not smart enough. He was already in her sights. Maria didn't hesitate. The shot rang out again. This time, the outlaw collapsed forward in his saddle, the horse swerving erratically as he slumped to the side. The horse continued to gallop, bucking wildly as the rider's limp body slid from its back, hitting the earth with a heavy thud. Maria didn't wait to see the full result. She was already shifting positions, making sure she wasn't caught in the open. She quickly scanned the remaining rider, the one now fully aware of the danger. He had turned his horse around, his hand gripping the reins tightly as he began to retreat. He had no idea how close he was to being Maria's next target, but she wasn't going to give him a chance to run. He had crossed the line, and now he would pay the price for it. Her rifle was already raised again, her eye at the scope, her finger lightly grazing the trigger. But before she could fire, a shout erupted from behind her. "Maria, don't! We've got him cornered!" Maria's heart skipped a beat as she whipped her head around. Jack had emerged from the house, running toward the fence line where the last rider was fleeing. He was waving his arms, trying to signal to the outlaw that there was nowhere left to go. "Jack!" Maria shouted, her voice suddenly frantic. "Get inside. Get back to cover." But Jack didn't listen. He was too far gone, his protective instinct for his wife clouding his judgment. The last rider was turning, preparing to make his escape. He was already trying to draw his weapon, but Jack's sudden presence in the open field made him hesitate. Maria had no time. Without thinking, she adjusted the scope, aiming at the outlaw's shoulder, where she could disable him without killing him. The shot rang out. The rider cried out, the bullet grazing his arm and sending him reeling from the saddle. He tumbled to the ground with a grunt of pain, his revolver falling from his hand. Jack froze, staring at the fallen man, his eyes wide with surprise. Maria lowered her rifle, her breathing labored. The fight was over. All three of the outlaws lay on the ground, incapacitated, one dead, one wounded, and the last one just barely hanging on. Jack stood there, motionless for a moment, before turning slowly to face her. His expression was a mixture of confusion, admiration, and something else, fear. What the hell was that, Maria?" he whispered, the words heavy with disbelief. You're a sniper?" Maria didn't answer at first. She was still focused on the fallen riders, making sure they weren't going to get back up. She could feel Jack's gaze on her, the weight of the question hanging between them. She had never intended to let him know, never wanted him to see the side of her that had been trained to kill. "I told you to stay inside," Maria said softly, her voice surprisingly steady. "You shouldn't have come out here. These men, they weren't just passing through." Jack opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. He looked down at the fallen men, then back at Maria, his mind clearly racing to process what had just happened. But you..." Later, she cut him off, her voice firm. "Right now, we need to make sure they're not going to come back. Help me tie them up. We'll figure this out once we're safe." Jack nodded, still in shock, and moved to help her. Maria stayed close to the window, watching for any more threats on the horizon. The ranch was still safe for now, but deep in her gut, she knew this was only the beginning. The outlaws had made their move, and now Maria Lawson was going to make hers. The sun was beginning its descent into the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch. The quiet of the evening had settled in once again, but it felt different now. The tension hung thick in the air, and Maria's mind was on high alert. She moved with purpose, her steps firm as she went about securing the outlaws. The first rider, the one she had taken down, was still lying lifeless in the dirt, his body half covered in dust, a cruel reminder of what had happened. His blood, dark against the earth, seeped slowly into the cracks of the dry soil. The second rider was unconscious, a bloodied gash on his shoulder, while the third lay writhing on the ground, clutching his side where Maria's shot had struck. His face was pale, his breath shallow, but he was still alive. For now, Maria turned to Jack, who stood a few paces away, his gaze still fixed on the fallen men. His hands were shaking slightly, though he tried to hide it. Maria could see the confusion in his eyes, the disbelief at what had just transpired. She could only imagine what was going through his mind. His wife. His quiet, reserved wife. had just taken down 3 outlaws with ruthless efficiency, and he had no idea who she really was, what she was capable of. She walked over to him, her boots crunching in the dirt. "Help me tie them up," she said, her voice steady but edged with urgency. Jack snapped out of his daze and nodded, though his movements were stiff. He hadn't seen her like this before. He hadn't known the side of her that had been forged in war and violence. To him, Maria had always been a calm, gentle soul, someone who cared for the ranch and for him, someone who had put the past behind her. Maria didn't blame him for not understanding. She hadn't wanted him to understand. But now, there was no choice. He had seen too much. The outlaws had come for them, and she had been forced to protect what was hers. They moved together, tying up the outlaws with careful precision, securing their arms and legs with heavy rope. Maria worked efficiently, her years of training making her quick and methodical. Jack helped, though he was still clearly processing what he had witnessed. He couldn't seem to shake the look of disbelief on his face. Once the outlaws were secured, Maria stood up, surveying the scene. The sun was almost gone now, the sky a deep orange with streaks of purple. The ranch was quiet again, but it felt different. The land that had once been a place of peace and safety was now marked by violence, by danger. She had kept it away for so long, had buried her past, but it had caught up to her. "Maria," Jack's voice was hesitant, still trying to find the right words. He stood beside her, his eyes flicking to the bound men and then back to her. What the hell happened? Who are these men? Why did they come after us?" Maria sighed, turning to face him. She could see the fear in his eyes now, the fear of the unknown, the fear of what he had just seen. She understood it. She had lived through the same fear once. But it was time to face it, time to share it with him. "They're outlaws," she said quietly, her gaze flicking back to the men. "Bandits. They've been working for a man named Frank Dalton. He runs a criminal empire, Jack. He's been terrorizing the region for years. And I'm sure these men were sent by him." Jack's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "Frank Dalton," he repeated, the name foreign to him, but somehow familiar in a way he couldn't place. "But why come here? Why us?" Maria hesitated, looking down at the ground for a moment. She had always tried to shield Jack from the brutality of her past, but now, she could no longer hide the truth. The ranch, this life they had built, had become a target. Frank Dalton's men were ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to take what they wanted. "They came after us because they thought we were easy pickings," she said, her voice steady but laced with a coldness that hadn't been there before. "I used to be something else, Jack. A long time ago, I was a Marine sniper. A damn good one. Frank Dalton's men know who I am. They know what I'm capable of." Jack's eyes widened, his face pale as the weight of her words sank in. You were a sniper?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maria, I had no idea. I didn't want you to," she replied softly, her gaze never leaving his. "I left that life behind. I didn't want you to know the woman I used to be. But the past doesn't stay buried, Jack. Not forever. And now it's come looking for us." He stood there, stunned. For a long moment, the shock of her confession settling heavily between them. Finally, Jack spoke, his voice tight. "So that's why they came here. They knew who you were, and they thought you just, what? Run? That's what they're used to. They're used to people backing down, giving in." Maria nodded, her eyes narrowing as she looked down at the men lying bound on the ground. "That's right. They've taken from people their whole lives. But I won't let them take from me." Jack swallowed hard, his eyes shifting from the outlaws to his wife. "What now?" he asked, his voice uncertain but tinged with a newfound respect. "What do we do?" Maria turned her gaze to the horizon, the darkening sky casting long shadows across the land. She knew what had to be done. She knew that these outlaws were just the beginning. If Frank Dalton's men were here, it meant the worst was yet to come. "We fight back," she said, her voice low but resolute. "We don't run, and we don't give them what they want." She looked back at Jack, her eyes fierce with determination. "We take them down, one by one. We take Dalton's empire apart, piece by piece. And we make sure this never happens again." Jack nodded, his expression hardening. "All right, Maria, let's do it." Maria smiled, a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. It had been a long time since she had felt this kind of resolve. The outlaws had underestimated her, and now they would pay the price. But this wasn't just about revenge. This was about protecting what was hers, what she and Jack had worked so hard to build. It was about sending a message. Dalton's men had made their move, and now Maria Lawson, the quiet rancher's wife, would make hers. And the storm she was about to unleash would bring their corrupt empire to its knees. The night was closing in quickly, the stars already beginning to glimmer in the vast desert sky. The winds had picked up, carrying the faint scent of dust and sagebrush, as if the land itself was warning of the storm to come. Maria stood on the porch, her arms folded, her gaze locked on the distant hills. The quiet that had once been a comfort now felt oppressive. There was no mistaking it. Danger was closing in, and it was only a matter of time before Frank Dalton's men would come again. Jack had disappeared into the barn, no doubt gathering supplies, trying to get his head around what Maria had just told him. She could hear the clinking of tools, the familiar sounds of the ranch she knew so well, but everything felt different now. Her mind raced with thoughts of what had to be done. She had been down this road before. Long before Jack, before the ranch, before peace had ever found her. This time, however, there would be no hiding. Maria's fingers tightened around the rail, her knuckles turning white as she thought of what was to come. Frank Dalton's empire was built on violence, on fear, and on the back of men like the ones she had taken down earlier. They were ruthless, unrelenting, and if they were coming for her now, they would stop at nothing until they had destroyed everything she cared about. The wind whipped across her face, and for the first time in years, she felt the familiar weight of her old life pressing back against her. The life of precision, of patience, of being the hunter. Her training had been forged in the fires of war, and now, that same cold efficiency would have to be turned on Dalton's men. She wasn't just defending her ranch. She was defending the life she had built with Jack. The life that had been earned, not given. And she wasn't going to let it go without a fight. The soft creak of the barn door behind her broke her thoughts. Jack stepped out, a rifle slung over his shoulder, his face set in determination. He looked at her, his expression different than before, more resolute. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't asked for the world Maria had hidden from him. But now, it was impossible to ignore. "Got everything?" Maria asked, her voice calm, though inside, her pulse was still racing. Jack nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Enough to hold them off, but not for long. There's a few things I've got around here, but I'm not sure how long we can keep it up." Maria turned toward him, meeting his gaze. "We won't need to hold them off for long. We just need to make sure they know we won't be easy to take down. I'll take care of the rest." Jack didn't ask how, and Maria was thankful for that. He was already in the mindset of defense, but she had something else in mind. "They'll come for the house first," she said, her voice steady. "They'll want to take us by surprise. But if we can slow them down, make them think we're scattered, they won't know what hit them." Jack stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "What do you need me to do?" Maria glanced at the barn. It was a good vantage point, and they could use its height to their advantage. The land surrounding the ranch was open, but it also provided ample cover for an ambush. But that wouldn't be enough. They needed to be strategic, calculated. "I need you to get the horses into the north pasture, Jack," she said. "Make sure they're well hidden, out of sight. We can't risk them getting spooked if things go sideways." He nodded immediately, without hesitation. Done. Maria didn't want to ask him to do this. She didn't want him to see the side of her that had been buried. But there was no other choice now. The ranch was their home, and they needed to protect it. Jack was no stranger to hard work, but this was something different, and he was beginning to see that. "I'll be ready," Jack said, determination setting in. "I've got your back, Maria. You're not alone in this." Maria felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she knew the danger had only just begun. Jack had no idea of the depths of her past, of how she had been trained to fight, to kill. But tonight, he would learn. Maria didn't say anything more. Instead, she moved toward the barn. It was time to set the plan in motion. As she entered the barn, the smell of fresh hay and leather mixed with the scent of metal and gunpowder. She walked toward the back, where her old gear had been carefully stowed away. The sniper rifle was the last thing she wanted to pick up, but it was the one thing that would give her the edge. She hadn't used it in years, hadn't even thought about the life it had come from. But tonight, it would be her only ally. She slid the rifle out of its case, her fingers running lightly over the smooth barrel. The memories came rushing back. Training exercises, cold nights in the desert, the sound of her heartbeat in her ears as she squeezed the trigger. The lives she had taken, the lives she had saved, the things she had done in the name of something bigger than herself. She glanced back at the open barn door, her heart racing with the weight of the moment. The calm had been shattered, and she knew that everything she had worked for was at risk. But she had always been good at keeping a clear mind in the chaos. It was time to make sure that this time, the chaos worked for her. She took a deep breath, adjusting the scope on the rifle, testing the weight in her hands. The wind was lighter now, the air cooler as the night began to settle. She was ready. The outlaws wouldn't know what hit them. Her mind was sharp as she scanned the horizon. There was no more waiting. She had to make the first move. She had to take them down before they even knew she was there. As she moved into position, the sound of hooves grew louder, closer. She didn't hesitate. Her fingers wrapped around the rifle's trigger, her mind focused entirely on the task ahead. The war had come to their doorstep, but Maria Lawson was ready for it. And tonight, she would show them just how far she would go to protect what was hers. Maria kept her breathing steady, slow. Her eyes never left the view through the scope. The land before her was open, barren, but it gave her an advantage. The ranch house sat at the far end of the open plain, a few trees scattered nearby providing minimal cover. The wide horizon stretched endlessly before her, giving her plenty of time to react. Jack was moving, the distant figure of him just visible as he led the horses into the north pasture, far out of sight of the main path leading to the house. He wasn't as familiar with this kind of fight, but Maria knew he'd do what he could to stay out of harm's way. The outlaws might think they were attacking a defenseless ranch, but Maria wasn't about to let them make that mistake twice. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her hands remained steady as she adjusted the rifle, taking stock of the terrain once again. Every inch of it was burned into her mind. The men who came for them had no idea what they were walking into. A gust of wind blew across the plains, carrying with it the scent of dust and the faint musk of the horses. The wind would be her ally tonight, softening the sound of her movements. But it wasn't the wind she was focused on. It was the rhythmic sound of the approaching riders. She had already taken down 2 of them. The third man was still down, groaning on the ground, clutching his wounded shoulder. She hadn't wanted to kill him, but it had been necessary. Outlaws like him didn't deserve mercy, and if they weren't stopped now, they'd tear apart everything she and Jack had worked for. The last rider, he was the real threat. He was the one still fully capable of making a mess of the ranch. Through the scope, Maria watched the last outlaw approach. He was moving slowly now, his horse limping slightly, likely due to the chaos of the other riders scattering. He was glancing behind him, clearly uncertain of the fate of his comrades. He should have been worried. Maria had already anticipated his movements. She gently exhaled, aligning the crosshairs on his torso. This would be the final shot, the last bit of the storm that had hit the ranch. And once this was done, the threat would be over. Her finger was just about to pull the trigger when, a faint crack in the distance, a figure moved on the ridge. Maria's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes snapped to the horizon. A figure, too far out to be one of the riders, was perched on the distant hilltop. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been lying in wait. The outlaw's attention was now divided. He had been so close to being the next casualty of Maria's precision that he hadn't noticed the additional threat. Maria's instincts flared. The tension in her muscles coiled tightly, but she kept her body still, her gaze locked on the new figure. The man on the ridge was armed, and he had his rifle trained on her. Her mind flashed into overdrive, calculating options. He couldn't have known she was there. There was no way. Maria had been too careful. But somehow, he had picked up on something she'd missed. The shot was too risky. Taking down the last rider now would leave her exposed to the riflemen on the ridge. But if she waited for the outlaw to get any closer, she risked a full-blown confrontation, and she couldn't allow that. Maria slowly shifted her position, pulling the rifle back and away from the window with practiced precision. Her body moved as if she were an extension of the landscape itself. Her fingers stayed light on the rifle, barely pressing the trigger guard, moving almost as if in slow motion. She had no room for error. The wind picked up again, a gust that made her feel momentarily at peace. It was a small comfort, but it was enough to give her the clarity she needed. She had two choices: take the shot at the outlaw below, or deal with the unseen threat on the ridge. She wasn't about to let any more outlaws mess with her home. Her decision was made. With swift efficiency, Maria shifted her position, drawing her rifle down to her side. The figure on the ridge was far enough away that she could make a quick move without giving herself away, but he was close enough to put the ranch in danger if she didn't act fast. She moved carefully, silently, toward the back of the barn, her movements swift and calculated. Her boots barely made a sound on the floor as she slipped out the side door of the barn and into the cover of the outbuilding. Her heart raced, but her breath remained steady. The ridge was visible from here. The man hadn't moved from his spot, but his attention seemed to be focused on the direction of the ranch house. Maria could use the barn to her advantage. Its position gave her a natural line of sight to where the man was crouched, rifle still raised. She peered through a crack in the barn door, her breath steady as she aimed down the sights of her rifle once more. She could feel the familiar weight of it in her hands, the grip reassuring. The man on the ridge wasn't expecting her to be in the barn, and he had no idea that she was about to take him down. Maria's fingers grazed the trigger again. Her breathing slowed, the adrenaline creeping in. She felt the coldness of her training, the precision of 1,000 calculated shots. She could already see the outcome. Her finger tightened. The shot rang out. A plume of dust kicked up from the earth, but the man didn't even have time to react. The bullet hit him square in the chest, and he collapsed backward, his rifle falling from his hands. He had no chance. Maria stayed low, her breath coming in quiet, controlled bursts. The second threat was eliminated. Now, the ranch was quiet once again. Maria quickly turned, sliding back into the house, where Jack was already waiting by the door, his hand resting on the rifle he had pulled from the barn. She shook her head slightly, looking at him with a level of cold detachment that only a sniper could understand. "It's done," she said softly. Jack looked at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. Relief? Fear? Awe? "You took them all down." Maria didn't answer right away. Her gaze turned back to the horizon, the spot where the last rider had fallen. "The storm's not over, Jack, but we've got one less threat to deal with." She stepped closer to him, her hands shaking for the first time in hours. She didn't want him to see it, didn't want him to understand how deep her old life went, but she couldn't stop it. She had done what needed to be done, and this fight was far from over. Maria took a deep breath, trying to steady the unease building inside her chest. The ranch was still, eerily so. The wind had died down, leaving only the sound of her pulse ringing in her ears. She glanced over at Jack, who was still watching her, his expression a mix of wonder and concern. She could feel the weight of his gaze, but for once, it didn't bother her. There was no more hiding. Jack had seen it. He knew what she was capable of now. "We're not done," Maria said, her voice calm but firm. "They won't leave us alone after this. If Frank Dalton is involved, we're just beginning to see the trouble. They'll be back." Jack nodded slowly, still processing everything. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, unsure of what to say. It was clear he was struggling to reconcile the quiet rancher's wife he had known with the woman standing before him now, the woman who had taken down 3 armed men without hesitation. "We need to be ready," Maria continued, her voice steady. "Dalton's men are ruthless, but they don't know us. They don't know how far I'll go to protect this place." Jack's hands clenched at his sides, and Maria could see the resolve hardening in his eyes. "I don't know much about this Dalton fella, but I know one thing. No one's taking what's ours." He glanced at the men tied up outside, the remnants of their attempted attack, and then at Maria, his jaw set. Where do we go from here? Maria turned back toward the window, her eyes scanning the horizon. The stillness felt unnatural now. She could feel the storm brewing, not just in the sky but in the air around them. The quiet ranch she had fought so hard to protect wasn't safe anymore. Frank Dalton's men were out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. We make sure they know this place isn't easy pickings, Maria said, her voice low. We need to send a message. No more running. No more hiding. Jack nodded, understanding her intent. He had seen the fire in her eyes, something that had been buried for so long. He was beginning to understand the kind of woman he had married. But even as his thoughts swirled with concern, something else was rising within him. A desire to protect, to stand by her. She was no longer the woman he thought he knew. And yet, she was more than he had ever imagined. Maria turned away from the window and headed for the door. We have work to do. Later that evening, as the sun set and darkness settled over the ranch, Maria and Jack worked in unison, preparing for what was to come. Maria had already checked the perimeter, making sure there were no other surprises hiding in the shadows. She could feel the weight of the situation, the knowledge that the worst was yet to come. She needed to stay sharp. She needed to be ready. In the barn, they gathered their supplies, ammo, extra rifles, and whatever they could use to fortify their position. Maria had one eye on Jack, who was busy securing the barn door, making sure everything was in its place. He wasn't used to this, she knew that. But the man she had married was proving he could stand with her, even if he didn't fully understand the depth of what they were facing. When everything was set, Maria walked to the back of the barn, where her sniper rifle rested, waiting for her touch. She slid it out of the case, assembling it with practiced hands. The weapon felt familiar, grounding her, steadying her thoughts. The Outlaws had made the mistake of underestimating her once. They wouldn't make that mistake again. Maria, Jack called, his voice low as he approached her. Are you sure about this? I've seen what you can do, and I'm not questioning it. But we need a plan. We can't just go off half-cocked. Maria turned to face him, meeting his eyes. We don't have time for plans, Jack. They're coming for us. And when they do, we need to show them we're not afraid. He opened his mouth to respond, but she held up a hand, cutting him off. I know what you're thinking. You want to protect me, but we're in this together now. And I'm not going to hide who I am, Jack. Not from you. Not from them. The intensity in her voice hung in the air between them, thick and heavy. For a long moment, Jack didn't speak. He simply looked at her, the weight of her words settling over him like a cold breeze. The woman he had married was a fighter. No, more than that, she was a warrior. And whatever storm was coming, he was going to stand beside her. Maria took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the horizon once more. She could feel the presence of danger drawing nearer, the knowledge that everything they had built was on the line. It was time to take a stand. She wasn't going to let Dalton's empire crush them. Not now. Not ever. They'll come tonight, Maria said softly, as much to herself as to Jack. They'll think we're vulnerable, but they're wrong. We've got the advantage. We know the land. We know how to fight. And we won't go down without a fight. Jack stepped forward, a look of determination on his face. All right, Maria. What do we do? Maria's lips curved into a grim smile. We hit them first. The night was thick with tension as Maria and Jack waited in the shadows of the barn, their weapons ready. The Outlaws would be coming soon. This much Maria knew. She could almost feel their approach, the familiar weight of impending danger pressing in on her. But she wasn't afraid. She had lived through worse. She had survived the brutality of combat, the sting of loss. And now, she would do whatever it took to protect the life she had built. Jack was by her side, his jaw set in grim determination. He had no experience with outlaws or gunfights, but he trusted Maria, and for the first time, he understood that she was more than just his wife. She was a force to be reckoned with. The night stretched on, and the darkness deepened. Every sound, every creak of the land, seemed to carry the weight of what was coming. The quiet had settled back over the ranch, but Maria knew it wouldn't last. The Outlaws were close now, and when they came, she would be ready. The ranch house was quiet, the only sounds the faint rustling of the wind and the occasional clink of metal as Maria checked her rifle one more time. The night felt heavier now, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She could sense the stillness, the way the air seemed to shimmer with anticipation. Jack moved quietly beside her, his steps sure but careful. He wasn't the trained fighter Maria had once been, but there was a look in his eyes now, one of determination and something else, respect. He was no longer just the rancher's husband. He was part of this fight, whether he was ready or not. "We have to keep them off the house," Maria whispered, her voice low but urgent. "They'll try to break in, and if they do, they'll overrun us quickly." Jack nodded, his jaw tight with resolve. "How do we do that? I mean, we don't have much." Maria glanced out over the darkened ranch yard, the shadows of the barn and the open fields stretching out like a blanket of uncertainty. "We use the land. We use the cover. They'll be expecting us to be hiding, scattered in fear. But we're going to make them think otherwise. We're going to make them come to us, and when they do, we'll take them down one at a time." The sound of hooves reached her ears just as the wind shifted. Her breath caught in her chest. It was subtle at first, like a whisper on the horizon. The riders were coming, moving closer. Jack stiffened beside her. "Do you think it's them?" Maria didn't answer immediately. Her eyes scanned the distance, the faint outline of the horizon where the road to the ranch twisted. The riders hadn't come into full view yet, but the unmistakable sound of hooves crunching over gravel and dirt was growing louder, closer. "Yes," she said finally, her voice firm. "They're here." Her hands moved with purpose, reaching for her rifle, setting the scope to the right level. Her finger brushed the trigger guard. The first rider appeared on the ridge, his silhouette jagged against the night sky. Another appeared beside him, and then another. The group was larger than she had anticipated. 5 men in total, all armed and clearly not here to negotiate. Maria's heart beat faster now, but her mind was clear, calculating. There was no fear. She had been in situations like this before, but the stakes were higher now. This wasn't a battlefield. This was her home, her husband, the life they had built together, and she would defend it with everything she had. "Stay low," she murmured to Jack, her eyes never leaving the approaching outlaws. "Let them think we're hiding. Let them come closer. The closer they get, the better." Jack crouched beside her, his hand gripping the rifle, but he didn't aim it yet. He trusted her instincts now, even if the situation felt overwhelming. Maria was the one who had seen this kind of violence before. She knew what to do. The riders continued to move closer, slowing their pace, perhaps sensing something was off. Maria's eyes flicked to each of them, assessing, calculating. She had already picked her targets. The leader would be the first to go down, and then the others would follow. They were disorganized, but if given the chance, they could easily overwhelm her and Jack. It was critical to strike quickly. Her breath slowed. The wind picked up again, and she used it to steady herself. The moment was almost here. One of the riders turned toward the house, a long shadow moving across the land. He had seen something, maybe the flicker of light from the window or a movement in the barn. But he had no idea that Maria was already locked onto him. He was the easiest target, too far from cover to make a move. Maria's fingers slid over the trigger, her heart steady despite the tension building in her chest. She exhaled slowly, feeling the familiar weight of the rifle against her shoulder. Her scope locked on the rider, his profile clear and vulnerable. This would be a clean shot. She squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle echoed through the night, sharp and sudden, followed by the unmistakable sound of the man's body hitting the dirt. He didn't even have a chance to scream. The shot had been clean, silent, deadly. The rider crumpled to the ground without a sound, his horse bolting away in a panic. For a moment, the other riders stood frozen, trying to assess where the shot had come from, their eyes scanning the landscape. They had no idea they were being hunted, but Maria had already shifted position, moving swiftly into the shadows behind the barn. She knew this land better than anyone, and she had a plan. Jack looked at her, wide-eyed, but Maria only gave him a small nod. "Stay low. They're going to think we're scattered." He crouched down, following her movements as they shifted around the property, staying out of sight. The remaining 4 outlaws had split up now, some heading toward the house, others staying behind, clearly trying to flank them. Maria's mind raced as she tracked their movements, her eyes flicking between the men as they moved into position. The second rider came into view. This one was closer, moving cautiously, clearly trying to figure out where the shot had come from. Maria didn't waste a second. She moved, positioning herself behind a pile of firewood just outside the barn, the shadows offering her cover. She could hear the man's footsteps now, his breathing shallow, his rifle held loosely at his side. When he was close enough, Maria took the shot. The rider dropped instantly, his body twitching for a moment before going still. The horse, startled, bolted in the opposite direction, leaving the rider's lifeless form in the dust. 2 down. The remaining 2 riders now knew for sure they were under attack. They weren't just outlaws anymore. They were running scared. But that made them more dangerous. And Maria knew she had to finish this quickly. The wind had picked up again, swirling the dust around the ranch, but it wasn't enough to mask the quiet, growing tension. The last 2 outlaws had split off, their movements more cautious now, but there was no mistaking the fear beginning to show in their eyes. They weren't prepared for this. They had underestimated Maria, and now they were scrambling, trying to make sense of the chaos she had unleashed. Maria watched from behind a stack of crates near the barn, her rifle trained on the 2 men. They were getting closer, moving in opposite directions, seemingly unaware that they were slowly walking right into her trap. Her breath was steady, controlled. She could feel the familiar rush of adrenaline, like a pulse running through her veins, a reminder of the woman she once was, the sniper who had taken down enemies from miles away, with only the wind and her focus to guide her. Jack was nearby, staying low as he moved toward the back of the barn. His rifle was in hand, his face set in grim determination. He had never wanted any part of this life, but Maria could see in his eyes now that he understood what needed to be done. She couldn't ask for more from him, and yet he was here, by her side, in this fight for their lives. The first outlaw, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, had moved closer to the barn. His footsteps were light but deliberate, the crunch of the gravel under his boots the only sound breaking the silence. He was scanning the ground, looking for any signs of movement, but Maria knew he was too focused on the wrong things. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, her aim steady, the man's silhouette framed perfectly in the crosshairs. She had done this 1,000 times before, but this time, it was different. This time, it was personal. She exhaled slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. 1 shot, 1 kill. She squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, sharp and quick, cutting through the stillness of the night. The man didn't even have time to react. He crumpled to the ground, his body jerking once before falling face first into the dirt. The horse he had been riding bolted, the sound of hooves pounding the earth as it fled the scene. Maria didn't wait to see the aftermath. She had already moved, shifting to a new vantage point, keeping one eye on the second outlaw. He had heard the shot, and now he was scrambling, his hand reaching for his revolver as he looked around frantically. The man had made one fatal mistake. He wasn't thinking. He was panicking. Maria's mind was clear, her every sense attuned to the movements of her prey. The outlaw was starting to make his way toward the house, trying to flank her, but he was running blind. He didn't see the land the way Maria did. She knew the lay of the ranch, the places where he could hide, and where she could catch him. She slid the rifle back into position, her breathing steady as she lined up the shot. She didn't rush this one. She knew that patience was key. She needed him to make one wrong move. The outlaw stopped for a moment, looking back toward the barn, trying to pinpoint where the shot had come from. That was all Maria needed. Her finger pressed against the trigger again, her breath coming slow and measured. Focus. The shot rang out, and the man went down with a scream, his body falling sideways as he hit the ground hard. His revolver clattered from his hand, landing in the dirt with a dull thud. He didn't move again. The last of the outlaws had been taken down. Maria lowered the rifle, her heart still racing, but her hands steady. She had done it. She had taken out the threat, just like she had done countless times before. But this time, it was different. This wasn't a battlefield far away, where lives were measured in numbers and strategies. This was her home, her life, and she would protect it no matter the cost. The silence that followed the shots felt thick, almost suffocating. The last two men were down. Jack, who had been crouched behind the barn, finally stood, moving cautiously toward the bodies. Maria followed, keeping her rifle in hand, eyes scanning the horizon for any more threats. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not now. When Jack reached the fallen men, he paused for a moment, looking down at them. His face was hard, his expression unreadable. Maria could tell that this wasn't what he had imagined when they first moved out here to the ranch. But it was the reality now. It was the world they lived in. "Is it over?" Jack asked, his voice low, tinged with disbelief. Maria nodded, her eyes on the bodies. "For now, but Dalton won't stop. Not unless we make sure he knows we won't back down." Jack turned to her, his gaze intense. "What do we do next?" Maria's mind raced, but she didn't hesitate. "We find out who else is involved. We track them down, piece by piece. And we take down their empire, starting with Dalton." Jack's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. He knew this wasn't just about protecting the ranch anymore. It was about survival. The outlaws had come for them, and now they had made a deadly mistake. The battle wasn't over. It had just begun. Maria's gaze shifted to the horizon, the darkness settling in as the night deepened. Somewhere out there, Frank Dalton was pulling the strings, sending his men to do his dirty work. But now, they had a target on their backs. And Maria wasn't going to rest until she had torn his empire down. "We don't stop," she said firmly, her voice steady. "We take it to them. All of it." Jack nodded, his resolve hardening. "We do it together." Maria gave him a nod, her heart steady now. She had spent years running from her past, hiding the woman she had once been. But not anymore. Now, she would fight. For her home, for Jack, for everything they had built. And anyone who tried to take it from them would learn just how far she was willing to go. The sky had darkened fully now, the stars shining brightly above, and the silence that had settled over the ranch seemed almost too calm. But Maria knew better than to let her guard down. The world around her felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the next strike. Frank Dalton's empire had already sent their men, and the message they had received tonight would only provoke a response. They would come again. It was inevitable, but when they did, they would find a different rancher's wife than the one they had expected. Maria stood at the edge of the barn, her gaze sweeping over the land she had fought so hard to protect. The outlaws' bodies lay a few yards away, tied and left for the authorities to deal with, but Maria knew that wasn't the end of it. Dalton's men were ruthless, and they wouldn't simply disappear because a few of their number had been taken down. No, they would be back, and they would come with more firepower, more bodies. Jack had gone to the house to make sure everything inside was secure, but Maria couldn't stand still. The ranch felt too exposed now. The horizon was empty, but she felt the weight of the night settling over her, each minute feeling like it dragged on longer than the last. A distant sound broke through her thoughts, the sound of hooves. Maria's body tensed, but she didn't move. She knew it wasn't one of the outlaws returning. The pattern was too irregular, too slow. Whoever it was had not come to fight. But that didn't mean it was a welcome sight. She moved quickly, ducking low and silently moving to the side of the barn. From there, she had a clear line of sight to the main road that led up to the ranch. The sound of hooves grew louder, and Maria narrowed her eyes, trying to make out the shape of the rider in the distance. It wasn't the outlaws. No, this figure was riding with a slow, deliberate pace, no sign of urgency in his movements. And yet, Maria didn't trust it. She had learned long ago to trust her instincts, and something about this rider didn't sit right. Her fingers hovered over the grip of her rifle as she prepared herself for whatever came next. The rider came closer, his silhouette taking shape in the fading light. A man, dressed in dark clothing, his hat pulled low over his face, casting a shadow across his features. The way he rode was calm, too calm for someone on a dangerous mission. Whoever he wasn't in a hurry, and that meant one thing. He was looking for something. But what? Maria took a few steps forward, keeping herself hidden behind the barn. She needed to make sure of his intentions. He was almost upon her now, the sound of his horse's hooves louder as he slowed, just outside the range of her rifle. "Who are you?" Maria called out, her voice steady but firm. The rider froze, his horse stopping abruptly at the sound of her voice. There was a long pause, then a low, gravelly voice replied, "Just a man passing through. Thought I'd stop for a word." Maria's mind raced. This wasn't random. No one just passed through this part of the country without a reason. And the man's calm demeanor only served to increase the suspicion stirring in her gut. "Don't move any closer," Maria said, her voice sharp. Her rifle was still in her hands, steady, aimed at the stranger's chest. She was ready to take the shot if he made one wrong move. The rider raised his hands slowly, showing he wasn't armed, but Maria didn't trust it. The silence stretched between them like a rope ready to snap. "I mean no harm," the man said, his voice smoother now, trying to placate her. "I've heard of the trouble you've had, and I've come to offer my assistance." Maria's eyes narrowed. "Assistance?" she repeated, lowering the rifle slightly, but not fully. "From who?" The man's smile was barely visible beneath the brim of his hat. "From someone who knows what you're facing. From someone who has had his fair share of run-ins with Frank Dalton's men." Maria's grip tightened on her rifle. Dalton. The name sent a cold chill down her spine. This man knew about Dalton? About the Outlaws? "I don't need help," Maria said firmly, her eyes still locked on him. "I can handle myself." The man's eyes flicked to the rifle and then back to her. "I'm not here to fight you. I'm here because I know what's coming, and I think you'll want to hear what I have to say. But it's your choice." Maria hesitated, her mind working through the options. She had no reason to trust this stranger, no reason to believe a word he said, but something about the way he carried himself, so confident, so calm, made her wonder if there was more to his story than he was letting on. She had been alone for too long, and Jack didn't know how to deal with men like this. Maria had lived through it. She had seen men like him before. "If you know what's coming," she said, her voice low and dangerous, "you better start talking. Because I don't have time for games." The man's smile faded slightly, but he didn't move. He didn't need to. He knew he had her attention now. "I've been working against Dalton's operation for years," he said, his voice becoming more serious. "I've seen what he's done, what his men are capable of, and I've been trying to take him down from the inside. But I can't do it alone, and neither can you." Maria's mind raced. Was this man telling the truth? Did he really know how to bring down Dalton's empire? "I know you don't trust me," the man continued, sensing the doubt in her gaze. "And I don't expect you to. But we're not so different, you and I. We both want the same thing, Dalton's empire to fall. And I have the means to help you do it." Maria's fingers hovered over the rifle's trigger again. The weight of his words hung in the air between them, thick with possibility. "Who are you?" Maria demanded, her voice harsh, distrust still coloring her tone. "And why should I believe you?" The man took a deep breath, then lowered his hand. Reaching into his coat, he pulled out a worn, faded piece of paper, holding it out to her. "You've heard of a man named Ray Montgomery?" Maria's heart skipped a beat. Montgomery. She had heard the name before, a man known for his dealings with Dalton's enemies, a former mercenary who had his own set of skills that could bring Dalton's operation to its knees. The stranger's eyes met hers, steady and resolute. "I've been working with Montgomery for years. He's the one who can give you the leverage you need to take Dalton down. All you have to do is make the choice. Help us, and we can end this nightmare." Maria's mind was racing. This was the break she had been waiting for, the key to destroying Dalton's empire. But was this man truly who he said he was? Could she trust him? Maria hesitated for only a moment before lowering her rifle, taking the paper from his hand. She would need to see this through. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. "All right," Maria said, her voice steady, filled with the weight of what was to come. "Tell me everything." Maria unfolded the piece of paper slowly, her eyes scanning the faded ink. It wasn't much, just a few lines of text with an address and a name at the bottom. Ray Montgomery. The address was in the nearby town of Mesquite Flats, a place she knew well enough to recognize as a town that had seen more than its fair share of trouble. It was a place where men like Dalton and his kind went to lie low, to make their deals in the shadows. If Montgomery was there, it was a sign that things were moving, things Maria needed to be part of. The stranger waited, his face unreadable, but Maria didn't trust him yet. Not fully. His story felt rehearsed, too clean. It was the sort of thing someone like Dalton's men would tell her, trying to gain her trust. But the name Montgomery meant something. He was known among the few who fought against the corruption Dalton had built. And if Montgomery was involved, that meant the time for Maria to take action had finally come. She folded the paper back up, her eyes locked on the stranger. "You didn't tell me who you are," Maria said, her voice steady but cold. "And I'm not in the habit of trusting people who don't tell me their names." The man stood tall in the moonlight, his posture rigid, but there was something about him that suggested he wasn't afraid. Not of her, not of anything. He didn't flinch when she spoke, his eyes betraying no hint of nervousness. "I'm Jack Rowan," he said simply, "and I'm not here to deceive you. I came because I know what's coming for you. For both of us, if we don't do something about it. Dalton's men are looking for a reason to come after you, and after Montgomery, and they're going to start with the ones closest to him. That means you, Maria, and it means I need your help." Maria's eyes narrowed. She didn't like the way he spoke, like he knew everything about her life, and yet, she knew nothing about him. She had learned long ago that people like this, strangers who appeared in the middle of a fight, were often dangerous. But there was something in his words, something that rang true. Dalton wasn't a fool. He would send men to deal with her. His enemies always knew when they were a threat. "How do I know I can trust you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her hand still resting on the rifle in case things went south. She had no intention of letting her guard down just yet. Rowan raised his hands, a gesture of peace, though Maria still didn't let her finger drift too far from the trigger. "I'm not here to make a deal with you," he said. "I'm here to help take down Dalton's empire, once and for all. I've been working against him for years. You want him gone, and so do I. But you can't do this alone." The words hit harder than Maria expected. She had spent so many years keeping her distance from anyone who could pull her back into the life she had left behind. The thought of trusting someone again, even in this fight, felt foreign. Yet she couldn't ignore the sense of urgency she felt deep in her gut. Everything about this situation was bigger than her, bigger than Jack. Dalton's empire stretched far beyond the outlaws who had attacked the ranch. And if they were going to bring it down, they would need help. Real help. Maria took a deep breath, her mind spinning with calculations. She had always been a lone wolf, moving quietly in the shadows, doing the work that others couldn't or wouldn't. But the game had changed. She needed to play smarter, faster. Dalton had men everywhere. There was no way she could take him down without getting dirty, and that meant working with someone who understood the terrain. "Tell me what you know," Maria said, her voice firm. Rowan's expression softened slightly, as if the trust she had shown in him had allowed him to relax just a little. "Dalton's men are a network, scattered throughout the region. They control more than you might think. Smuggling, extortion, and worse. But Montgomery has been working on a way to hit them where it hurts. We've got information about Dalton's operations, but we need a little more muscle." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Maria could tell he wasn't lying. There was a certain sincerity in his voice that didn't match the usual pretenders she'd encountered over the years. "I know where Dalton's supply routes are," Rowan continued. "I know where his shipments are going. But we need someone who knows how to move, how to strike fast. Someone like you." Maria stared at him for a moment, weighing his words carefully. If what he said was true, if they could take down Dalton's operations from the inside, it could be the beginning of the end for his entire empire. She had been fighting in the dark for too long, avoiding the true battle because she had been afraid of her own past. But she couldn't run anymore. Not when Jack's life, and her own, was on the line. "I'll need more than just talk, Rowan," she said, her voice colder now, more calculated. "If I'm going to risk this, I need proof. I need to know I'm not walking into a trap." Rowan's gaze didn't falter. "Fair enough. But I can't give you everything right now. What I can offer is a chance to take Dalton down, once and for all, and a chance to finally put an end to all this. But that means you have to trust me." Maria took a step back, looking out toward the horizon, the lights of Mesquite Flats flickering in the distance. Her mind raced, thoughts colliding with one another. Jack was safe, for now, but that wouldn't last. Frank Dalton's reach was long, and the outlaws who came for her would be only the beginning. She knew what was at stake. "I'm not trusting anyone blindly," Maria said, her voice hard, "but I'll give you one shot. You get me Montgomery, you get me the information. Then we'll see if this alliance is worth anything." Rowan smiled slightly, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Deal." Maria turned back toward the barn, her thoughts already racing through the next steps. The game had changed. Dalton wouldn't see it coming, but she wouldn't take her eyes off the horizon. Not for a second. As Rowan mounted his horse, ready to ride off to Mesquite Flats, Maria felt the weight of what was to come pressing in. This was the beginning. But it wasn't the beginning of the end for Dalton. It was the beginning of the end for everything he had built. And Maria Lawson was going to be the one to tear it all down. The night had fallen heavy, the silence of the desert wrapping around them like a blanket. Maria watched Rowan as he rode off into the darkness, heading for Mesquite Flats. She knew he was a man of few words, but his promise had struck her deeply. For the first time in a long while, the possibility of taking Dalton's empire down didn't seem so far-fetched. But trust, true trust, was still a fragile thing. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not yet. Jack approached her quietly from behind, his boots making soft sounds against the dusty earth. "You trust him?" he asked, his voice low. Maria didn't answer immediately. Her mind was still processing everything. The plan, the risk, the chance that they could actually defeat Dalton and his men. There was a part of her that wanted to go it alone, to continue fighting in the shadows. But Dalton had built an empire from nothing, and to bring it down, she would need more than just skill. She would need allies. Real ones. "I don't know yet," Maria finally replied. Her gaze focused on the silhouette of Rowan fading into the night. "But he's our best shot." Jack didn't say anything more, just stood there next to her, the quiet understanding between them heavier than any words could express. Maria knew he wasn't comfortable with all of this. He had never signed up for a life of danger, a life where every day brought the threat of violence and death. But Maria could see the change in him, the way he had stepped up since the attack on the ranch. He was no longer just the rancher's husband. He was a part of this fight, whether he liked it or not. "You'll be safe, Jack," Maria said softly, turning to him. "I won't let them hurt you." "I know," Jack said, his voice steady. "I trust you." Maria didn't know if she could truly keep him safe. How could she? Dalton's reach was vast, but she couldn't afford to fail. Not now. The next day, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, Maria set to work preparing for what was to come. They couldn't stay in the ranch for long. Frank Dalton's men would eventually come looking for revenge, and when they did, they'd come in full force. But Maria wasn't going to wait around for them to make the first move. She had already fought the battles of the past. Now it was time to fight for the future. She needed to strike fast, and she needed to do it with precision. She knew the terrain better than anyone, and she'd been planning her next move since the first shot rang out the night before. There was no room for error. They couldn't afford to leave any trace, any clue that might lead Dalton's men to the ranch. Jack had taken the horses to the northern pasture, hiding them out of sight for now. There was no need for them to be seen, especially if Dalton's men sent scouts to track them. Maria turned toward the barn, preparing to load up the supplies she would need for the journey. It was time to meet Rowan in Mesquite Flats. Jack approached her as she was finishing up, his face set in determination. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Maria didn't meet his gaze. I have to do this. I need to get to Montgomery and find out what he knows. If he has the information we need to bring Dalton down, then we can end this." "But we don't have much time." Jack stepped forward, his hand lightly resting on her shoulder. "I'm going with you." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She turned toward him, her expression softening slightly. "Jack, you don't have to. This is too dangerous. I won't let you get involved." "I'm already involved, Maria," Jack replied, his voice firm. "And I'm not sitting around while you face it all alone." Maria's mind raced. She had always kept Jack at arm's length from this part of her life. She didn't want him to know the horrors of her past, the things she had seen and done. But Jack wasn't the man he used to be. He had grown, just as she had, in the face of the threat they now faced together. He was right. There was no turning back now. They had both crossed a line, and now they had to fight together. She nodded, a sense of resolve settling over her. "All right," she said quietly. "We'll do this together." Later that afternoon, Maria and Jack made their way to Mesquite Flats. The sun was hot, the dry desert air swirling around them as they rode side by side. The landscape was barren, but it held a certain beauty in its simplicity. As they neared the outskirts of the town, Maria's eyes scanned the horizon. They were getting closer. She could feel it. The town was a little more than a handful of buildings, but it was far from deserted. People had their reasons for coming here, reasons that didn't always involve honest work. As they neared the town's edge, a figure appeared in the distance. A man on horseback, his silhouette unmistakable. It was Rowan. He rode up to them, his horse's hooves kicking up dust as he pulled to a stop. He had his usual air of calm about him, but there was an urgency in his eyes now. "You made it," Rowan said, nodding toward Maria and Jack. "Good. We don't have much time." Maria's eyes narrowed. "What's going on?" Rowan's gaze flicked over to Jack, then back to Maria. "Dalton's men are already looking for you. They've gotten wind of the attack on your ranch. They're not going to stop until they find you. But Montgomery's got something that could help us hit them hard. He's in town, hiding out at a safe house not far from here." Maria's pulse quickened. They were running out of time, but she didn't hesitate. "Lead the way." The tension in the air was thick as they approached the safe house. Maria's mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead, of Montgomery, of Dalton, of everything that had brought them to this moment. She had always worked alone before, but now, with Jack at her side, the stakes had never been higher. This was the beginning of the end, and Maria Lawson wasn't about to back down now. The dusty streets of Mesquite Flats were eerily quiet as Maria, Jack, and Rowan made their way deeper into the small town. The heat from the midday sun was oppressive, the air dry and sharp in their lungs. The buildings around them looked weathered, as if they had seen too many years of hard living. The quietness of the town made Maria feel even more tense. It wasn't the silence that bothered her. It was the way the wind carried the weight of old secrets. This town had seen its share of bloodshed, and now it was about to witness more. Rowan led them down an alleyway between two rundown buildings, their footsteps muffled by the thick dust underfoot. His horse was tethered nearby, and he motioned for Maria and Jack to follow him into the shadows. Maria's heart began to race. She had no idea who Montgomery was, or what kind of man he had become after years of working against Dalton. She only knew that this was their best shot at finally taking the fight to the heart of Dalton's operation. "Stay sharp," Rowan said quietly, his voice low. "Montgomery doesn't trust easily, but he'll listen to you, Maria. If you can make him see the urgency, he'll help. We need his intel." Maria didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her mind was already running through the possibilities. There were too many variables in play, too many risks. But this was their chance to put the pieces together. If Montgomery knew where Dalton's operations were, where the shipments were coming from, then they could hit him where it would hurt the most. Maria had spent too many years waiting for an opportunity like this, but now that it was finally in front of her, she felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest. The alleyway opened up to a small courtyard with a few half-empty buildings, their windows boarded up or covered with rags. At the far end, a low, nondescript building sat quietly. There was nothing remarkable about it. A simple, square building with no sign of life around it. But Maria knew that was part of the plan. This was where Montgomery had been hiding. And if everything went according to plan, it would be the turning point they needed. Rowan knocked 3 times on the door. The sound echoed in the stillness of the alley, and for a brief moment, Maria felt a flicker of doubt. What if Montgomery didn't show? What if this whole thing was a trap? The door creaked open slowly, and a man stepped out of the shadows. He was older than Maria expected, his face worn and hardened by years of constant danger. His clothes were patched, his hair graying at the temples. But his eyes, they were sharp, assessing, like a man who had learned to survive in a world full of enemies. "You must be Montgomery," Maria said. her voice steady but laced with an edge of curiosity. The man studied her for a long moment before his gaze flicked to Jack and then back to Maria. "I'm the one who's been keeping an eye on Dalton's operations," he said, his voice rough. "And you must be the one who has a vendetta against him. What is it you want?" Maria didn't flinch. She had come this far. She wasn't about to hold back now. "We want Dalton's empire to fall. We want to hit him where it hurts. I've been fighting his men for too long, and I can't do it alone. We need your help." Montgomery leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "You're right about one thing. Dalton's empire is crumbling. But you're wrong about one thing. You can't just hit him. He's not some outlaw you can shoot down and call it a day. He's got connections everywhere. You'll need more than just good aim to bring him down." Maria nodded, her eyes steady on Montgomery. "We don't have time for talk. We need information. I've already taken down his men, his scouts. We know he's got a shipment coming through. If you know where it's going, we can hit it before it gets to him." Montgomery studied her for a long time, his eyes calculating. Finally, he spoke. "You've got guts. I'll give you that. But if you want to bring down Dalton, you need more than just muscle and a few guns. You need leverage. And right now, I've got the key to that leverage." Maria stepped forward. "What are you talking about?" Montgomery's voice lowered, a hint of something darker in his tone. "I've been working against Dalton for years, but it's not enough to just sabotage his operations. I've been gathering intel, but the real key to bringing him down is someone on the inside. Someone who can feed us the information we need." Maria's brow furrowed. "Someone on the inside? You mean a mole?" Montgomery nodded slowly. "Exactly. There's a man who's been working for Dalton for years. His name is Cyrus Drake. He's one of Dalton's top men. Runs security, makes sure everything stays in line. But I've got a contact on the inside who says Drake's looking to jump ship. He's got the knowledge we need, but getting to him won't be easy. He's a slippery bastard, and he trusts no one. But if you can make him trust you, we can finally hit Dalton where it matters." Maria felt a surge of adrenaline. This was bigger than she had anticipated. If they could get to Drake, if they could make him talk, they could finally take Dalton's empire apart. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick, but it would work. "We'll find him," Maria said, her voice resolute. "But we don't have time to waste." "Where is he?" Montgomery's eyes narrowed. "He's in the next town over, about a day's ride. But getting close to him won't be easy. He's got a reputation for disappearing. You'll need to make contact with one of my people in that town. They'll know how to get you to him." Maria glanced at Jack. He nodded. They both knew what had to be done. There was no more turning back. This was their chance. Maria turned back to Montgomery. "Give us the information. We'll take it from there." Montgomery handed her a piece of paper, scribbled with directions and a name. "Get to him fast. If Dalton catches wind of what you're trying to do, it'll be the last thing you ever do." Maria took the paper, the weight of the task ahead settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about taking down Dalton anymore. This was about breaking the backbone of his entire operation. She folded the paper carefully and turned to Jack. "Let's get moving." With Montgomery's directions in hand, they turned and left the safe house, their next step clear. The storm had only just begun, and Maria Lawson was going to make sure that Dalton wouldn't see the end of it. The sun hung low on the horizon as Maria and Jack rode side by side, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they made their way along the dry, cracked roads toward the next town. The weight of their task was heavy, but the air between them was filled with a silent resolve. Every hour they spent on the road brought them closer to the heart of Frank Dalton's empire, and closer to taking it all down. Maria's mind was sharp, running through every possibility, every step they would need to take to find Cyrus Drake. He was the key. If they could get to him, make him trust them, then they could break the chain that held Dalton's operation together. But it wouldn't be easy. Drake was known for his ability to vanish when things got too hot. Getting close to him would take strategy and patience. Jack, on the other hand, was quieter than usual, his thoughts clearly on the danger they were walking into. Maria could feel the tension in him, the uncertainty. He wasn't a fighter by nature. He'd been thrust into this world, and while he was brave, she knew how much it weighed on him. "You okay?" Maria asked, her voice soft but knowing. She didn't need to ask if he was ready. She knew he was, but the strain of the situation was written all over his face. Jack glanced over at her, his jaw set, his eyes hardening in the way that only came when he was fully committed. "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady. "I just keep thinking about what comes after." Maria nodded, understanding what he meant. "After we get Drake, the real fight starts. It's not going to be easy, but we're not backing down, Jack. We can't afford to." "I know," he replied, his tone softer now. "But it's not just about Dalton anymore. It's about all the people who've suffered because of him, all the lives he's ruined, the things we've seen. I can't stop thinking about what happens after." Maria gave him a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "We do what we can, Jack. We do what we can to make sure that when this is over, we can finally move on. But until then, we stay focused. We take down Dalton. We take down Drake. And then, we finish this." The silence that followed was comfortable in its own way, both of them lost in the gravity of the task ahead. Maria turned her gaze back to the horizon, the rolling hills and the distant town growing closer. They were almost there. By the time they reached the town of Silver Creek, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets. The small town was more than just a waypoint for travelers. It was a haven for those who had business to conduct under the cover of darkness. The kind of business that Maria was now a part of. They rode through the town, careful to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Silver Creek was a place where whispers carried, and Maria wasn't sure how many eyes were on them. She didn't want to be recognized, not yet. They needed to find Montgomery's contact, get the information about Drake, and move quickly. Rowan had told them the contact would be waiting at the old saloon at the far end of town. Maria steered her horse toward the dimly lit building, the sound of piano music filtering out through the cracks in the door. It was just the kind of place where people like Drake could hide in plain sight. As they tied up their horses outside, Maria gave Jack a quick glance. "Stay close. Keep your eyes open." Jack gave a curt nod, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. "I'll watch your back." They entered the saloon, the doors swinging open with a creak, revealing a smoky, dimly lit interior. The usual assortment of townsfolk were scattered around the room. Drunks, gamblers, a few men hunched over in dark corners. But Maria's attention was immediately drawn to the man sitting alone at the bar. He was the one Rowan had described, broad-shouldered, his face weathered by years of hard living, but his eyes sharp, calculating. The man didn't look up as they approached, but Maria could tell he had already noticed them. He had that quiet, dangerous aura about him. Without a word, Maria sat down next to him, Jack taking a stool beside her. The man raised his glass, taking a slow sip before speaking. "You must be the ones Rowan sent." Maria's gaze remained fixed on him, assessing. "We need information on Cyrus Drake," she said flatly. "Where is he?" The man looked over at Jack for the first time, his eyes calculating. "You don't look like the type to be chasing ghosts. But I guess you'll do." He set his glass down and leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "Drake's been laying low. He knows Dalton's men are onto him. But I can tell you this, he's been spotted near the mines outside of town. They're a good hiding spot, and no one asks questions there." Maria's heart quickened at the mention of the mines. It was exactly the kind of place where a man like Drake would disappear. The isolation, the danger. It was perfect for someone who needed to stay off the grid. "We'll need directions," Maria said. "And we need to know how to get to him without being seen." The man leaned back in his chair, eyeing them both carefully. "It won't be easy. You'll have to go through the outskirts of town, past the old mill, and then follow the old path up into the hills. But be careful. The place is crawling with Dalton's men. They know Drake's been in and out of there." Maria's jaw tightened. She had anticipated that, but hearing it from someone who knew the area made it all the more real. It would be dangerous enough that they would need to plan their approach carefully. "I'll take it from here," she said, her voice firm. "Thanks for the information." The man gave her a small nod. "Don't say I didn't warn you." Maria and Jack left the saloon, the weight of the task ahead heavy in the air. They had the information they needed, but now the real work would begin. It was one thing to find Drake, but getting him to talk, and making sure Dalton's men didn't get to him first, was another matter entirely. As they made their way out of town and into the darkened hills, Maria's mind raced. They were close, so close. But with every step they took, the danger grew more immediate. The storm they had started wasn't finished. Not yet. And the fight was far from over. The night seemed to stretch on longer as Maria and Jack navigated the darkened roads toward the mines. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light casting eerie shadows across the rocky terrain. The silence between them was thick, but Maria could feel Jack's unease growing with every mile they covered. He wasn't used to this kind of danger, the constant vigilance, the underlying tension, but he was with her, and that was something Maria didn't take for granted. She glanced at him now, his face set with determination, but she could see the quiet war waging in his mind. He was used to the ranch, the simplicity of hard work and the comfort of a predictable life. But that life was gone now, replaced by something far darker. And as they neared the mines, Maria could sense the weight of that darkness pressing closer. "You sure about this?" Jack asked, his voice low, though it still carried the weight of concern. Maria didn't hesitate. "I'm sure. Drake's the key. If we want to bring Dalton down, this is the only way." Jack nodded, though his expression remained tight. He wasn't fully convinced, but Maria had seen the fire in his eyes, the same fire she had seen in herself, back when she had first joined the fight against the cartel. They were in this together now, whether they liked it or not, and together, they would finish what they had started. They reached the outskirts of the town, passing the old mill. The path to the mines was barely visible in the dark, winding through thick brush and jagged rocks. Maria kept her focus, her instinct sharp, always scanning for signs of danger. Every sound, every rustle in the wind, made her nerves tighten. She had been trained for moments like this, when the world seemed still, but danger was lurking just beneath the surface. As they moved closer to the mines, the air grew heavier, the scent of sulfur and earth mixing with the bitter tang of sweat. The mines were an old operation, long since abandoned by the original owners, but still in use by those who had no other place to hide. It was a perfect spot for someone like Drake to lay low. Isolated, dangerous, and full of hiding spots, Maria motioned for Jack to stay close as they approached the mine entrance, which was little more than a gaping hole in the side of the mountain. It was dark inside, the only light coming from a few lanterns scattered around the entrance, their flickering glow casting long, uneven shadows. Maria could hear voices inside, low and muffled, but they didn't seem to be on high alert. She motioned for Jack to wait behind a large boulder as she crept forward, staying low, her footsteps silent on the rocky ground. She needed to get close enough to see who was inside before making any moves. If Dalton's men were here, they had to be dealt with first. She couldn't risk exposing their position to Drake, especially if he was hiding from Dalton's men. As she neared the entrance, she crouched behind a pile of old mining equipment, peering around the corner. She could see two men standing guard near the entrance, their backs to her. They were armed, but they didn't seem to be particularly alert, which was a mistake Maria was more than willing to take advantage of. She checked the position of the guards again, calculating her next move. One of them turned slightly, and Maria moved quickly, silently, her rifle raised. She didn't hesitate. The first shot rang out, clean and true. The guard crumpled to the ground, his body falling silently, the sound of his fall drowned out by the noise of the wind. The second guard whirled around, reaching for his weapon, but it was too late. Maria was already moving, her rifle swinging up, the shot ringing out with deadly accuracy. The second guard fell, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud. Both men were down, but Maria didn't move yet. She stayed hidden, her breathing steady, her focus entirely on the entrance. Inside the mine, the sounds had changed. The voices were louder now, more agitated, and Maria could hear the sound of footsteps moving toward the entrance. She quickly ducked behind the pile of equipment again, holding her breath as she waited for the approaching footsteps to pass. When they did, Maria didn't waste any time. She signaled to Jack, who crept up behind her, his movements cautious. She glanced at him, making sure he was ready, then nodded toward the mine entrance. "We move fast," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. "We get to Drake, and we don't let anything slow us down. Jack nodded, the seriousness in his eyes matching her own. Together, they moved swiftly toward the mine entrance, staying close to the shadows. The guards were down, but they couldn't afford to take any chances. Maria kept her rifle ready, every sense heightened, watching for any sign of movement inside the mine. As they neared the entrance, the faint glow of lanterns illuminated the interior, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The air inside was thick with dust and the musty scent of old wood. There were a few men gathered around a small table, but Drake wasn't among them. Maria's heart skipped a beat. Where was he? She motioned for Jack to stay low as they moved deeper into the mine, scanning for any sign of their target. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. And then, just ahead, Maria saw him. Cyrus Drake was sitting at a table in the far corner of the room, his back to them. He was alone, for now, but Maria knew better than to assume he didn't have backup hidden in the shadows. She moved forward cautiously, signaling Jack to follow. They didn't speak. There was no time for words. When they were close enough, Maria stepped forward, her rifle aimed at Drake's chest. "Don't move," she said, her voice sharp, commanding. "We need to talk." Drake's eyes flicked up, a flicker of surprise passing across his face before he masked it with a smirk. Well, I didn't expect to be greeted by a woman with a rifle," he said coolly, not even flinching at the weapon aimed at him. "Move, and I won't hesitate," Maria warned, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. "You're going to help us bring down Dalton." Drake raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? You think you can just walk in here and tell me what to do?" Maria took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You don't have a choice." Jack's hand was on his revolver, but he didn't speak. He was waiting, just as Maria was, to see what Drake would do next. Drake sat back in his chair, his eyes calculating, his hand resting near the table. "Maybe I do have a choice," he said, his voice steady, but there was a dangerous edge to it now. "But if you want me to help you, you'd better make it worth my while." Maria's grip on the rifle tightened. The game was on, and she wasn't about to let anyone stand in her way. Maria stood tall, the weight of the rifle steady in her hands as she faced Cyrus Drake. The tension in the air between them was thick, the kind that could snap at any moment. She wasn't in the business of waiting for opportunities, and she wasn't about to let Drake think he had any leverage in this situation. He might be important to Dalton's operations, but right now, he was a target. Jack remained quiet, standing by her side. His eyes narrowed as he kept an eye on their surroundings. There was no room for hesitation, no room for mistakes. If Drake thought he could bargain with them, he had another thing coming. Drake's fingers drummed slowly on the table, a deliberate motion that Maria couldn't ignore. He wasn't afraid. That much was clear. He was used to controlling the room, used to being the one who called the shots. But Maria wasn't about to let him take the reins now. "I'm not here to make deals," Maria said sharply, her voice cutting through the silence. "Dalton's empire is falling apart. If you want to walk away from this, you're going to help us take him down. If not, well, I'm sure I can make you reconsider." Drake's lips curled into a faint smile, his eyes never leaving Maria's. He leaned back in his chair, seeming almost amused by her words. "You really think I'm going to just hand over everything I know because you've got a rifle pointed at me?" he said, his tone cool and detached. Maria's eyes darkened. "I think you'll help us because you're smart enough to see which side of this battle is going to win. You've been working for Dalton for too long, Drake, but I'm offering you a way out. A chance to survive. That's more than most of Dalton's men get." Drake let out a small chuckle, but it didn't reach his eyes. "And why would I trust you?" His voice dropped to a near whisper. "How do I know you're not just another part of the game?" Maria took a step closer, her gaze never wavering. "Because I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm giving you a choice. Help us, or watch Dalton's empire burn, with you in the ashes. I don't need your trust, Drake. I need you to do your part." There was a flicker of something in Drake's eyes then, a hint of hesitation quickly masked by arrogance. He sat up straighter, his expression shifting slightly. Maria could see the gears turning in his mind, the calculations as he weighed his options. You think Dalton doesn't know about this little stunt you're pulling? Drake asked, his voice darkening. You think he won't send more men to take care of you? You don't know what you're getting yourself into, Maria. He's got people everywhere. Everywhere. Maria's grip tightened around the rifle, but she kept her composure. She wasn't here to back down. I know exactly what I'm getting into, and I'm still here. You're either going to help us, or you're going to regret it. Your choice. For a long moment, Drake said nothing. His eyes locked on hers, measuring her every word. Maria could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on them, but she didn't look away. She didn't need to convince him. She just needed him to make the right decision. Finally, Drake sighed, leaning forward as if he'd come to a conclusion. All right, he said, his voice low but firm. I'll help you. But make no mistake, Maria, this isn't a charity. You want my help, you're going to have to pay the price. Maria raised an eyebrow, not allowing herself to show any sign of surprise. What price? Drake smirked, his eyes glinting in the dim light. I don't do favors without something in return. I want Dalton's head. I want to see him burn for everything he's done, and I want it before I walk out of here. Understand? Maria's jaw clenched. She had known this wouldn't be easy. She had known Drake would want something in return, but this was more than she had anticipated. She glanced at Jack briefly, gauging his reaction. Jack didn't flinch, but Maria could see the hesitation in his eyes. He knew that getting Dalton was the ultimate goal, but there was something about Drake's cold request that didn't sit right with him. Fine, Maria said, her voice hard. You'll get your piece of Dalton, but you need to tell us everything you know. I don't want to waste time playing games. Where is Dalton's supply line? Where is he hiding his shipments? And most importantly, where do we find him? Drake didn't speak immediately. He took a deep breath, then reached into his coat, pulling out a small map. He slid it across the table toward Maria, his eyes never leaving her face. Dalton's supply lines run through the old rail depot in the hills to the north, he said slowly. That's where his weapons and goods are coming in. He's been using the tunnels under the depot to move everything in and out of town without anyone knowing. If you hit the depot, you'll hit him where it counts. Maria studied the map closely, memorizing every detail. It was everything she needed. The next step was clear. This was the break they had been waiting for. And Dalton? She asked, her voice unwavering. Where is he? Drake hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering with a trace of uncertainty. He's at the old manor near the border, the one he's been hiding in for years. No one knows it's his hideout, but I've seen him come and go. It's well guarded, but if you know the right way in. Maria's mind was already racing through the possibilities. The manor. That was where the final blow would land. She had no doubt Dalton was there, hiding behind layers of security. But it didn't matter. With Drake's information, they had a chance to bring him down. You'll get your chance at Dalton, Maria said firmly, looking back at Drake. We're going to take him down, and when we do, you'll get what you've asked for. But until then, you're going to help us take out his operations. Drake nodded, his expression unreadable. Fine. Just remember, when Dalton's gone, I'll be there to claim my prize. Maria didn't flinch. We'll take care of Dalton. You'll take care of the rest. Deal? Drake extended his hand, a silent agreement passing between them. Maria hesitated only a moment before she shook it, her grip firm and unyielding. The deal was made. Now it was time to finish this. Maria's mind raced as she folded the map that Drake had given her, tucking it carefully into her coat. The pieces were falling into place, but the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on her. She could feel the tension building with every step they took away from the mine. The information Drake had provided them was invaluable, but it was only the first part of their plan. With Dalton's operations laid out before them, the next move was clear: the rail depot. If they could destroy the supply lines, they would cripple his entire network. And if they could find Dalton along the way, well, the battle would end before it even started. Maria glanced at Jack, his expression hard and resolute, though she knew he was still processing everything. The man had stepped up in ways she didn't expect, but there were still moments where she could see the uncertainty flickering in his eyes. This was a far cry from the life they had built on the ranch. And as much as Maria had tried to protect him from the darkness of her past, She knew that there was no escaping the gravity of what they were doing. It was a war now, and they were both in it. The ride toward the depot was silent, the two of them navigating the rough terrain, their horses moving quickly but carefully through the jagged hills. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, and Maria could feel the air shift as night settled in. They were close. She could feel it in her bones. The depot, according to Drake, was hidden deep within a series of tunnels in the hills, a perfect location for Dalton to hide his shipments and avoid detection. The fact that Dalton had kept this operation so hidden spoke to his cunning. He wasn't just a brute. He was a master of survival. But that would be his downfall. The truth about the depot gave them the leverage they needed. "We're getting close," Maria murmured, her voice low. She didn't need to say it louder. Jack could sense it too. They were within striking distance now. "Stay alert." Jack nodded, his grip tightening on the reins. His eyes scanned the landscape, and Maria knew he was ready for what came next. They had seen enough danger in the last few days to last a lifetime. But there was no turning back now. As they reached the ridge overlooking the rail depot, Maria's heart skipped a beat. The depot was just as Drake had described, hidden, concealed among the rocky hills, with only a few faint lights visible through the cracks in the walls. It was a small structure, but the lack of any major activity or traffic told her that Dalton's operation was running smoothly, without interference. For now, Maria signaled for Jack to stop, and the two of them dismounted silently, their horses tethered to the trees just out of sight. The night was growing colder, the chill creeping into her bones, but Maria didn't let it distract her. This was the moment of truth. "Stay low," she whispered, glancing at Jack. "We need to get inside without alerting anyone. We don't know how many men Dalton has stationed here." Jack nodded, his face grim. He understood the stakes. They had no backup. They had no room for error. If they were discovered, this would be the last mission they ever undertook. They moved swiftly through the rocks and underbrush, staying in the shadows, their footsteps quiet on the uneven ground. Maria's mind was sharp, every sense attuned to the smallest sound. She could hear the faint rustle of wind through the trees, the distant creak of metal, but there was no sign of anyone moving nearby. When they reached the outer perimeter of the depot, Maria signaled for Jack to stop. Ahead, she could see the entrance, two guards standing lazily at the front, their guns slung across their backs, clearly not expecting trouble. The depot was far enough from town to feel secure. It was too quiet. Maria looked back at Jack, her gaze steady. "We take them down quick and silent," she said, her voice low. "I'll go left, you take right. On my signal." Jack didn't need further explanation. He was ready. Maria moved like a shadow, slipping through the brush, keeping low and quiet, until she was just behind the guard on the left. Jack mirrored her movements, his figure disappearing into the shadows to the right. The first guard was completely unaware of their presence. Maria drew closer, her breath steady, the rifle in her hands feeling like an extension of herself. When she was within range, she took the shot. The first guard crumpled to the ground without a sound. The second guard spun around just as Jack closed the distance. With quick precision, Jack silenced him with a swift blow to the head, his body collapsing quietly to the ground. Maria didn't waste any time. She moved quickly toward the entrance, checking her surroundings to make sure they weren't being watched. Jack followed, staying close behind her as they made their way to the side of the depot. The door was a simple wooden structure, no locks, no signs of heavy security. Maria knew that Dalton's men were always paranoid, but this depot was too small, too hidden to warrant the kind of defense they had expected. They were walking into a trap, but they had no choice. The information had been too valuable to ignore. Maria motioned for Jack to stand back as she gently nudged the door open, peering inside. The faint glow of lanterns illuminated the interior, but there was no immediate sign of movement. It was empty, at least it seemed so, but Maria couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She stepped inside, rifle raised, scanning the room. Jack followed closely, his revolver in hand, eyes darting back and forth. The depot was a modest operation, with crates stacked high along the walls, some marked with numbers, others with symbols Maria didn't recognize. This was the lifeblood of Dalton's empire. Guns, ammunition, and whatever else they were smuggling in and out of the region. Maria's eyes narrowed. Let's get to the tunnel. We find the shipment, and then we find Dalton's operation. This is just the beginning. Jack nodded, his face hard with determination. Let's end it. They moved deeper into the depot, carefully navigating the maze of crates and supplies. The path to the tunnels was just ahead, but Maria could feel something shifting in the air. Something was wrong. They weren't alone anymore. Someone else was here. A sudden shout from the back of the depot echoed through the room. Damn it! Maria cursed under her breath, her instincts kicking in. Move! The shout echoed through the narrow confines of the depot, bouncing off the walls and sending a wave of tension through Maria's body. She didn't have to look at Jack to know that he was already alert, his hand gripping his revolver tighter, his gaze darting to the shadows. This wasn't just a random shout, it was a signal. Dalton's men had caught wind of their presence. Move! Maria hissed, her voice sharp, and she darted toward the far corner, trying to stay as low and fast as possible. Jack followed, his footsteps barely audible against the wooden floors of the depot. The sound of boots pounding against the ground came from the far side of the room, the unmistakable shuffle of men rushing to respond to the disturbance. Maria's heart raced as she scanned the area. There were too many crates in the way, too many places to hide, but no time to retreat. They had no choice now. They had to fight their way through. A quick glance over her shoulder confirmed what Maria feared. A group of Dalton's men had entered the depot, coming from an adjacent room at the back. 4 of them, armed and moving fast, taking up positions behind the crates and barrels, their eyes scanning the area. Stay low, Maria whispered to Jack, her rifle at the ready. She didn't need to explain. He understood. The men were spreading out, forming a perimeter, but they hadn't seen Maria and Jack yet. There was a brief moment of confusion as the guards tried to figure out where the shot had come from. Maria's fingers tightened around the rifle's trigger, and she moved silently behind a stack of crates, aiming at the nearest guard. She took the shot without hesitation. The guard crumpled to the ground, the sound of his fall muffled by the thick air of the room. But the moment the first man hit the ground, chaos erupted. The remaining 3 men began shouting, scrambling for cover, their rifles raised and their eyes wild with panic. Maria didn't waste time. She shifted quickly, her rifle tracking the next guard, her breathing steady. This was her element, moving fast, calculating each shot, anticipating every move. She fired again. Another man went down, his body jerking from the impact of the bullet before collapsing in a heap behind a stack of crates. But the third guard was already moving, taking cover behind a large barrel. He had heard her shots, knew she was somewhere close. Maria knew that he'd try to flank them. Jack, left, she called, her voice sharp. Jack didn't need further instructions. He was already moving, his revolver drawn, aiming for the barrel where the guard had taken cover. The guard's head peeked out just for a moment, and Jack didn't hesitate. The shot rang out, a quick, clean shot to the head. The guard dropped instantly, the barrel rolling slightly as his body crumpled to the floor. Maria was already moving again, her rifle raised and aimed at the last man. He had gone silent, realizing that his comrades had been taken out with brutal efficiency. He wasn't going to give up without a fight, but Maria wasn't about to give him the chance to react. She fired again, and the last guard's body jerked backward from the impact. His rifle fell to the ground with a metallic clatter, and he was out, the final threat neutralized. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound in the room was the distant creak of the wooden floorboards and the faint echo of their breathing. Clear, Maria whispered, scanning the area to make sure there were no more surprises. She lowered her rifle, allowing herself to take a breath, though she could still feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. We need to move fast. Jack nodded, his face tight, but his focus unbroken. He was still processing the chaos of the fight, but there was no time to waste. Maria quickly moved toward the back of the depot, where the entrance to the tunnels was supposed to be. She was about to get what they came for, the key to bringing down Dalton's entire operation. But as she approached the door leading to the tunnels, something caught her eye. A glimmer of movement in the shadows. Maria froze, her her instincts kicking in again. She had missed something. Someone else was here. Her rifle snapped back into place as a figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the dim light. It wasn't one of Dalton's men. It was Drake. Maria's heart skipped a beat as the man stepped forward, his hands raised in mock surrender. He wasn't holding a weapon, but Maria didn't lower her rifle. Not yet. Drake? She asked, her voice low but filled with suspicion. What are you doing here? Drake didn't flinch. His expression was unreadable, but there was a glint in his eyes that told Maria he wasn't here by accident. I've been waiting for you, he said, his voice smooth. I knew you'd come, and I knew you'd get here eventually. Maria's mind raced. What do you mean, waiting for us? We're here to take down Dalton. Why are you helping us? Drake gave a thin smile, his eyes never leaving hers. Because you're not the only one tired of playing Dalton's game. You think you're the only one who's been working in the shadows? I've had my own plans for a while now, but there's no point in pretending you're in control anymore. You came this far, but you've made one mistake. Maria's grip on the rifle tightened. What mistake? Drake took a step forward, his gaze cold. You thought you could take down Dalton's empire with just a few shots, but Dalton has eyes everywhere. He knew you were coming. He knew exactly what you were planning. Maria felt the floor drop out from under her. It was a trap. This whole thing had been a setup. Before she could react, Drake's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist, forcing her to drop the rifle. Her heart raced as she tried to break free, but Drake was faster, stronger. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a flash of movement. Jack's revolver was already in hand, and the moment Drake lunged toward her, Jack fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the confined space of the depot. Drake's hand froze in midair, and he looked down at the growing stain on his shirt. For a moment, there was silence. His eyes, still locked on Maria, betrayed no hint of pain. You should have known, he whispered, his voice barely audible. And then, he collapsed, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud. Maria stood over him, breathing heavily, her heart still racing. Jack had saved her, and now they had one more task left. Finish what they started. Let's finish this, Maria said, her voice steady as she retrieved her rifle. They had no time for questions now. They had a chance to take Dalton down for good, and this time, they were going to make it count. The stillness of the depot was broken only by the soft echoes of Drake's fall. His body lay motionless on the ground, a faint pool of blood spreading slowly across the dusty floor. Maria stood over him, her chest rising and falling with every deep breath, her rifle still gripped tightly in her hands. The weight of what had just happened was settling in, but there was no time to dwell on it. Jack was already moving toward the back of the room, his revolver still drawn, scanning for any more threats. He looked back at Maria, his face tense, but there was a faint hint of relief in his eyes. He knew they were closer to their goal now. Maria turned away from Drake's body, forcing herself to focus. They still had work to do. The tunnels were just ahead. This was where Dalton's supply line was centered. They had to destroy it before Dalton's forces had a chance to retaliate. The depot was their final chance to sever the heart of his operation. Let's move, Maria said, her voice firm. She nodded toward the entrance to the tunnels. Jack didn't hesitate. He was already following her, moving swiftly and quietly through the depot. Maria's senses were heightened now, every step calculated. She could feel the adrenaline still pumping through her veins, but she knew better than to let it cloud her judgment. The job wasn't done. They reached the door leading into the tunnels, a simple metal structure reinforced with bolts. Maria paused for a moment, listening for any signs of movement on the other side. There was nothing. The depot was eerily quiet now, save for the distant sound of the wind outside. She motioned for Jack to take cover as she carefully unlatched the door, pushing it open slowly. The narrow passageway beyond was dark, the air cool and musty. The flicker of a lantern's dim light could be seen at the far end, where the tunnel turned sharply. Maria's eyes narrowed as she stepped forward, her rifle raised and ready. Stay close, Maria whispered, her voice a low rasp. We don't know what's down there. Jack nodded, his expression hard. He was ready. There was no going back now. As they descended deeper into the tunnel, the air grew colder, the scent of damp earth mixing with the faint metallic smell of old machinery. The tunnel was long, stretching beneath the hills, twisting and turning in ways that seemed to lead deeper into the heart of Dalton's operation. Every step they took brought them closer to their goal, and closer to whatever trap Dalton had set for them. The lanterns ahead flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows on the walls. They rounded another corner and stopped dead in their tracks. Ahead, a figure stood in the dark, leaning casually against the wall. Maria's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the man. It was one of Dalton's top lieutenants, the one she had seen overseeing shipments in the back of the depot. His presence here was no coincidence. "You're far from home, Lawson," the man said, his voice rough, like gravel scraping against metal. He stood tall, his rifle slung over his shoulder, a smug smile spreading across his face. "Did you really think you could just waltz in and destroy everything?" Maria's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on her rifle. "I've already taken out half of your men. What makes you think you'll be any different?" The man's smile faltered, but only for a moment. He knew she wasn't bluffing, but then he stepped forward, his posture becoming more threatening. "Dalton's not a fool. He knows you're coming. He knows exactly who you are, and he's been waiting for you to make your move." Maria's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let it show. Dalton had known all along. Everything had been a trap, a carefully laid plan to draw them in. The sudden realization hit her like a punch to the gut. "Did you think you'd just waltz in here and get away with it, Maria?" the man sneered. "Dalton's always one step ahead." A quick glance at Jack confirmed what Maria had already feared. The odds had just shifted again. This wasn't just about taking down Dalton's supply line anymore. It was about surviving the trap they had walked straight into. Maria stepped forward, her voice cold. "I don't need to walk away. I just need to make sure you don't walk out of here." The lieutenant's expression darkened, his hand moving toward the rifle slung across his back. But before he could draw it, Maria had already raised her rifle and fired. The sound echoed loudly in the narrow tunnel as the man collapsed in a heap, his body twitching slightly before going still. Jack exhaled slowly, his eyes flicking toward the fallen man. "I knew this wasn't going to be easy." Maria didn't answer. She was already moving forward, her eyes scanning the tunnel for any more surprises. They couldn't afford to waste time. They had to get to the heart of Dalton's operation. They moved quickly, following the winding path of the tunnel until they reached a large chamber. At the center of the room, a massive stack of crates was piled high, the contents unknown. The sound of distant voices echoed from behind the crates, growing louder as Maria and Jack moved into the shadows. "Dalton's men," Maria murmured, her voice barely audible. She could feel the adrenaline surge once more. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. Jack's hand rested lightly on his revolver as he glanced at her. "We take them out quick. We destroy everything." Maria nodded, her eyes locked on the men who were now visible in the dim light. There were at least 5 of them, all armed and talking amongst themselves, unaware of the danger that was about to strike. She didn't hesitate. She signaled to Jack, and they both moved into position, using the shadows to their advantage. The first shot rang out, silencing one of the men before he even had a chance to react. The others froze, their eyes snapping to the source of the sound. Maria didn't give them time to think. She fired again, taking out the second man in the blink of an eye. The others scrambled for cover, their guns drawn, but it was too late. Jack fired, his revolver sending another man crashing to the ground. The remaining 2 tried to make a run for it, but Maria was faster. She moved swiftly, taking them both down before they could escape. The chamber fell silent once again, the sounds of their fight still echoing in the tunnel. Maria stood over the bodies, her breath steady as she surveyed the damage. The supply line was destroyed, but there was one more thing to do. Dalton's operation needed to end here, once and for all. "We finish it," Maria said, her voice low but full of conviction. "We go after Dalton. This ends now." Jack nodded, his jaw set. "Let's end it." They moved forward, leaving the bodies behind, their goal clearer than ever. Dalton's empire was crumbling, and they were the ones who would bring it to the ground. The air felt colder as Maria and Jack moved deeper into the underground chambers, their steps slow but deliberate. The success of taking down Dalton's men at the depot was a necessary victory, but it was only the first chapter in the war they had started. With each passing moment, the weight of what they were about to face grew heavier. Dalton was close now, hiding in his manor just beyond these tunnels, and they had come too far to turn back. Maria's mind was sharp, her senses alert to every sound, every shift in the air. They had already cleared most of the guards, but Dalton's final defenses would be waiting for them at the manor. The risk was higher than ever, but Maria wasn't backing down. She had made it this far, and she wouldn't let Dalton, or anyone else, stand in her way. Jack moved quietly behind her, his hand resting on his revolver. He was used to the quiet life of ranching, but the time for hesitation was over. He had already shown he was ready to fight, ready to see this through. Maria could feel the tension in his posture, the determination in his eyes. He was in this as much as she was now, and there was no turning back. "We're close," Maria whispered, her voice low. She didn't need to say more. Jack knew what she meant. They came to a final bend in the tunnel, and through the cracks in the stone, they could see the faint outline of a large wooden door. The manor lay just beyond it. This was it. Maria moved cautiously toward the door, her every instinct screaming for vigilance. The faint glow of lanterns from inside the manor flickered through the cracks, casting shadows along the walls of the tunnel. She motioned for Jack to stay close, her rifle at the ready. This was it, the final confrontation. As Maria pushed the door open, the world seemed to fall into slow motion. The manor was exactly what she had expected, dark, ornate, and heavily fortified. Dalton's presence loomed in the air. His men were scattered throughout the large hall, seemingly relaxed, but Maria knew better. The moment they entered, all hell would break loose. They had to move fast, strike before Dalton had a chance to react. "Stay low," Maria murmured to Jack, her eyes scanning the room. The manor was quiet for the moment, but she knew they had only moments before the situation turned chaotic. They moved forward, slipping through the shadows, their steps synchronized. As they crept closer to the heart of the manor, Maria's mind was working quickly. There were too many guards in the way, too many obstacles between them and Dalton. They had no choice but to fight their way through. The first guard appeared in front of them, just ahead, standing next to a darkened window. Maria didn't hesitate. Her rifle rose quickly, the shot silent and clean. The guard collapsed without a sound, his body falling to the floor with a thud. Jack glanced at her, his eyes flicking to the door at the end of the hallway. "That's where we'll find him, isn't it?" he asked, his voice steady, though his hand tightened around his revolver. Maria nodded. "That's where this ends." They moved quickly now, taking out 2 more guards who were stationed along the way, each shot measured, calculated. The manor was eerily quiet, the only sounds their footsteps and the occasional creak of old wood beneath them. The walls seemed to close in around them as they approached Dalton's chamber, but Maria kept her focus. She had made it this far. Nothing and no one would stop her now. As they reached the door at the end of the hallway, Maria motioned for Jack to stay back. She raised her rifle again, prepared for whatever waited behind it. The door was heavy, reinforced with iron, but it opened without a sound when Maria gently turned the handle. Inside, Dalton sat at a large desk, his back to them. He hadn't heard them yet. Maria's pulse quickened. She had been tracking him for so long, through so many miles, through so many confrontations. This was the man who had built an empire of fear and violence, who had hurt so many innocent lives. And now, it was her turn to make him answer for it all. With her rifle raised, Maria stepped into the room, Jack following closely behind. Dalton didn't move. The sound of her boots echoed off the walls as they crossed the threshold. "You're a hard man to find, Dalton," Maria said, her voice calm but dripping with menace. Dalton's chair creaked slightly as he leaned back, finally turning to face her. He was calm, too calm, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the sight of them. "You've done well to get this far," he said, his voice smooth, almost admiring. "But you won't get any further." Maria's eyes hardened. "You've ruined too many lives. It ends here." Dalton smirked, a cold, calculating look in his eyes. You really think you can stop me, Maria? Do you know how much I've built? How many people I've bought? You're nothing more than a blip on the radar. Maria's grip tightened on her rifle. You've made a lot of enemies, Dalton, and I'm about to make sure you don't make any more. Dalton stood slowly, his hand reaching for the pistol holstered at his side. I've survived worse than you. You think you can just come in here and take me down? You're playing a dangerous game, little girl. Maria didn't flinch. I'm not playing, Dalton. I'm ending this. Before Dalton could draw his weapon, Maria fired. The shot was fast, clean, and accurate. It struck him in the chest, sending him stumbling back into his chair. He gasped, his hand clutching the wound as he collapsed, the weapon he had reached for falling to the floor. Maria stepped forward, rifle still aimed at him. This is where it ends, Dalton. He coughed, his breath ragged, his eyes wild with disbelief. You think you've won? You're just one more casualty in a long line of them. This empire, it's too big to fall. Maria's eyes never left him. Not anymore. As Dalton's breath grew weaker, Maria felt the weight of the moment settle in. He was finished. His empire was crumbling. This was the end of the line. She looked at Jack, who stood silently behind her, his eyes dark with the weight of what had just transpired. He didn't need to say anything. They had done it. They had brought Dalton to his knees. Maria took one last look at the man who had caused so much pain, and then she turned to leave. There was no more to say. The fight was over. Let's go, she said quietly to Jack, her voice steady. They walked out of the room, leaving the wreckage of Dalton's empire behind them. The silence that followed their exit from Dalton's manor was overwhelming. The air felt thick, but with every step they took away from the chaos, Maria felt a weight lift from her chest. It was done. Dalton, the man who had terrorized so many, was gone. His empire was in ruins. The life Maria had been running from, the woman she had buried, had risen to face him and had won. But even in victory, there was no time to celebrate. The battle had taken everything from her, and the aftermath left a somber quiet between her and Jack. The storm had passed, but the damage it had wrought would take time to heal. Maria led the way through the darkened halls of the manor, her mind still spinning with the events that had unfolded. Jack followed, his boots silent against the stone floor, his eyes scanning every shadow. He didn't need to ask if it was really over. He could see it in her eyes. The job was done. Maria, Jack's voice broke the stillness, soft but heavy with a weight of its own. She turned to him, her face unreadable. He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. You did it. We did it. Maria didn't say anything at first. She felt the exhaustion settling deep into her bones, the kind that only came after a long, brutal fight. But this time, it wasn't just physical. It was the toll of years spent hiding, of running, of facing enemies she'd never thought she could conquer. She had faced them head-on and come out on top. Her eyes softened just a little as she looked at Jack. It wasn't just me, she said quietly. We did it together. Jack nodded, his eyes fixed on her. We did. He let the words hang between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The bond that had been forged between them over the course of this battle was something deeper than either of them could put into words. Maria led them out of the manor, into the cool night air. The weight of the world still clung to her shoulders, but she was ready to carry it. For once, she felt like the battle was truly over. There was no more running, no more hiding. She had taken back control of her life. They mounted their horses, the night stretching endlessly before them. The manor was behind them, and ahead lay only the open road, a path that Maria knew would lead them away from the past. But there would be no going back. The life they had known, the life they had fought for, was gone, but a new one was waiting. Jack looked over at her, his gaze steady. Where do we go from here? Maria's lips curved into a faint smile. Anywhere, she said simply. For the first time in years, I think we have a choice. The words settled in the air between them, both heavy and light at the same time. The future was theirs. And with that thought, Maria urged her horse forward, Jack following closely behind. They didn't know where they were headed yet, but they didn't need to. For the first time, they were in control of their own fate. And as the sun began to rise on the horizon, casting its golden light over the land, Maria knew one thing for sure. This was the start of something new. A new chapter, a new life. And this time, nothing could stand in their way. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another special story.